afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. This is Cara Dina Sale from the Community Technical Assistance Center and the Managed Care Technical Assistance Center of New York State. This is the first webinar in our new series called Shattering Walls. This series was created by our clinical team here at CTAC as we began to identify areas that we wanted to bring more awareness to. This area of sexual violence, abuse, and agency are very important topics for us to continue to explore and discuss and respond to. We know many of you encounter survivors of sexual abuse and violence, or unfortunately both. This series aims to build more awareness around sexual abuse and violence and provide perspective and information about resources and best practices for providers who work with clients who may have experienced or are experiencing sexual abuse, violence, or assault. In this series, we will focus on general awareness and overview, a survivor's experience, the male perspective, community-based interventions, and conclude with best practices. Our presenters today are going to kick off our series with sharing their expertise in giving us an overview of these topics of sexual violence and assault and abuse, why it's important to bring awareness to it, as well as an overview of an assessment process. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to orient everyone to the WebEx system so that you know how to participate in today's event. Please note that upon joining the webinar, everyone is placed on mute to avoid any background noises that may distract others. If you do have a question, you can always raise your hand to ask a question, and Brianna, our host today, will help you with anything that you need. She's handling technical issues. You will have the opportunity to submit questions. So in the chat box, which is on your right, there's a little chat bubble. You can click that and chat in any questions you may have for our presenters, as we will have a Q&A portion at the end of today's webinar. In order to ensure that we are all able to answer as many questions as time permits, please send them at any point during the webinar, and we will be collecting them throughout the webinar. We're very excited and honored to have both Josie Torielli and Jamal Al-Siraj with us today. Josie is the Assistant Director of Intervention Programs at the New York City Alliance Against Sexual Assault, and Jamal is the Deputy Director of the New York City Family Justice Center at the Bronx Mayor's Office to Combat Domestic Violence. Once again, thank you so much for joining us, and we're going to get started. Josie and Jamal, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cara, and we're really honored and grateful to be here today. We're going to jump right into our presentation so that we can have as much time as possible at the end in order to get to all of your discussion, questions, and feedback. So hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us.
Yes, thanks so much. We're excited.
Okay. So we're just going to talk for a moment about what we're going to cover today. And what we really wanted to do when Jamal and I were sitting and thinking through this presentation is to think about both what we're calling interpersonal victimization. And we'll get into that in a moment, what we mean, and we're going to unpack that term a bit. What we also wanted to discuss was the different layers of identity and layers of oppression and privilege that will impact disclosure and healing for people who've experienced violence. So we're going to go through and unpack some of the terms so that we are kind of making sure that we're starting from a kind of place of understanding. We're going to talk about screening and assessment, and then we're going to talk about stance and ways of working.
And again, just to let everyone know, it is an overview. So we're going to try to do the best to give as much as we can on some of these topics. We're really excited for everyone who's going to be attending more in the series because I think they'll deep dive. Josie herself will be doing one a little bit later on some of the practical applications of what we're saying. So if you want to know more, that's great.
Okay.
So in terms of starting out, me and Josie, we've trained together in the past, and we always like opening with turning it to you all. I know it's maybe a bit early and on a webinar to ask you your thoughts in the chat box or otherwise, or maybe just think to yourself, but we have so much that we start with, you know, as living, breathing organisms in our societies, messages that we receive. So we want to think what comes to our minds when we think about sexual violence. I know we haven't defined terms yet, and that's okay. That's part of what we want to think is, you know, based on just if you let your brain respond immediately with whatever comes to it, what may come to mind in that when it comes to sexual violence. So take a moment to think about that. Some sort of related questions that come are who are the victims and who are the abusers. Again, we're using language that's charged and we haven't defined yet, but if you are having thoughts about, you know, what it means to use certain words, or when you hear these things, who are the typical victims or typical abusers, or what messages do we receive about what that is? Relatedly, another thing is when it comes to abuse or assault, some of these terms are used interchangeably, and maybe for some of you in your experiences, these are different things, or maybe when you've worked with folks who have experienced abuse, assault, sexual violence generally, they've defined things differently for you. So any of that, I think, would be great to for us to know, because we want to touch on that and thread that through the presentation throughout.
Great. So we're already starting to see some really great responses here. What we also want to encourage you to do is think about the narratives and where we're getting the messages that we get around issues of interpersonal violence, of trauma, where those messages come from, so that we can begin to unpack and think critically about those messages. Who has the power to provide that narrative, and how do we kind of adjust that power narrative to make sure that the people that we're working with also have the ability to construct their own story. We're going to give this just a few more moments.
I see folks are putting media, so that's one of the ones that sort of like, I'm happy to see that, because I do think we get a lot of messages from friends, family, but then also media. And a lot of it are messages we don't think about actively, but nonetheless influence the way we build a culture around supporting or not supporting some folks who have endured and experienced sexual violence. So yay for people who talked about non-cisgendered folks. We're going to talk about all those sorts of layers of identity and historical experiences later in the presentation.
Great. Okay, we're just going to give it about 30 more seconds. So if you have things that are coming to mind, please feel free to jump in. And if you do have questions about any of this, of course, we can add that to the discussion at the end of the webinar.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. Okay. So we thought it might be useful here to kind of talk about it. When Jamal and I were thinking about this presentation, what we really thought about was so many different categories of experiences that people have had. And really what it comes down to is interpersonal violence. And I think sometimes that term can be limiting, because when we think about interpersonal violence, we might be just thinking about violence between individuals and thinking about that as a kind of one-on-one term. So, you know, one person experiencing violence, one person perpetrating violence, or maybe even mutual, right? But what do we want to encourage you during this presentation and then in your work, because, you know, webinars are only as useful as being able to then translate that content into your everyday. But thinking about interpersonal violence on both a personal, so any violence between individuals, and then community violence. And so thinking about those different layers. And when I think about community violence, I'm also thinking about, so kind of 3 layers. And of course, the boundaries between these aren't so strictly defined, but I'm thinking about micro levels, which is maybe one-on-one. Then also within that, thinking about, is it mutual violence? Is it, what are the power dynamics? Then thinking about kind of the middle layer or meso level, which thinking about violence when it comes, you know, as related to one's community, someone's neighborhood, and then also thinking about the macro layer, or the, you know, maybe higher layer of systemic violence, and what kind of oppression, power, and violence occurs on a systemic level, and what's built into our institution.
And to support Josie on this, when we were thinking about it, you know, in my work, sometimes we think about, particularly when it's violence between individuals or perpetrated by one person towards another, or even like a family unit towards a person or another unit. We think about violence in a limited sense too, and as we talk about the ways that violence can move from a micro to a macro, we also want to talk, and we will talk about, the way that violence itself as a concept has many more layers and can manifest. So once someone told me early on when I started doing, you know, anti-violence work, that there's violence and there's doing something violently or behaving violently, and that's sort of like, we're gonna define some of the terms that fall under interpersonal violence, but really doing things that have an implication or an impact in which someone feels, you know, harmed is also really relevant. And when we think about community violence or macro violence, I think you can pull in things that we don't always see as, you know, we have many sub-examples of violence with the word, I think, more than 3 or 4 times on this slide. But even when it comes to, erasure and visibility, microaggression, all of these things that have a lot of historical significance structurally, these are things that we think matter when we want to think about someone's, complex trauma or history of victimization. So whole communities and individuals can feel it on a lot of different levels.
And absolutely, having experienced violence on so many different layers is a focus of attention in the work, and sometimes left out of that discussion. Okay. So now we're going to encourage you to do a little bit of thinking about terms. And certainly because the series is focused on sexual violence and different kinds of violence when it comes to sexual assault, we wanted to kind of offer up some terminology. While we're offering it up, we also wanted to acknowledge limitations and say that, these aren't like hard and steady rules, but these are kind of some general, when we think about these terms, this is what we're using. So for sexual assault, I'm going to invite you to read, that's from the Office of Violence Against Women. Right there, we have a limitation, right? Thinking about sexual assault through Office of Violence Against Women. And so certainly some of those things that we talked about at the beginning about considering who the victims are, a lot of times when we think about sexual assault, sometimes the narrative is it's something that happens to women rather than it's something that is common.
Also, and to that point, we thought about narratives and what that looks like. So, OVW is also an office, and every agency, state, entity is going to have a way, a lens, and a history in terms of how they've approached it. So like Josie said, I think a lot of the inherited narrative for most folks early on in the work has been that this is an issue, maybe even exclusively, propagated by folks who identify as men, and often cis men, against cis women. And so we know that these terms sometimes can be limited, but we're going to talk about sort of expanding and challenging our notions of who can be impacted by these issues.
Okay, so the next area of focus I wanted to talk about was sexual abuse. And here really the distinction, one of the distinctions I should say would be we're talking about a pattern of behavior. I think also sometimes history of, that term is sometimes we think of sexual abuse as perpetrated against children, but certainly it could be any kind of longstanding maybe pattern of behavior that's impacting someone. We'll talk about violence, right? So World Health Organization has kind of a generic term that we like to use. And then the final note for domestic violence, that can be a term that's maybe not used, or you might see that used intermittently with intimate partner violence, which is coming up on the next slide. Domestic violence sometimes is a term that isn't used as much anymore because it does kind of carry these assumptions of cohabitation or that the people have to be like living together or domestic, right?
Yeah.
And so we will talk about intimate partner violence and how that maybe includes a broader spectrum of patterns within relationships. For domestic violence, the thing that it does cover is it would cover familial relationships and violence within familial relationships.
Exactly. So in this case, I have heard in my work, the DV-focused work side of things between the two of us, that, DV has been used to include like parent or caretaker violence against children or sibling violence. As we move to the next slide in a second, I can say that, family systems can be involved for partners can exploit family systems to help them perpetuate violence or coercive behavior, but that I think domestic violence is the broader term, the broader umbrella term, and intimate partner is a subset. There's some slightly different elements, and I think as we transition to the next slide, I can talk about that in more detail. Again, I want to just underscore the fact that violence can include systemic violence. It can include sort of, privileging. And first time we say that word, we're going to say it a few more times later, standalone, but at least privileging certain social values and norms. I think for some folks who intergenerationally have felt attacked or oppressed, that can also be something under the spectrum of violence. So think about the limitations of these terms too.
Okay, so we're just continuing on here, and as we discussed, so one term that you might hear that's used more frequently is intimate partner violence, and again, that can include kind of manners of relationships.
And so there's some patterns between the previous slide when it talked about domestic violence. I think it had talked about power and control, using tactics to gain power and control. The idea is it could take some time to do that. Many folks who've experienced domestic violence have shared that when they first entered a relationship, there weren't always giant red flags that said this person is going to try to gain power and control over me. So it's a paradigm that takes a little bit of time for some folks to be fully realized, but that one partner's intent is to do that. And through a range of abusive and coercive behaviors. Again, we didn't have enough time, I think, to do a complete DV standalone training, but the idea that although there's violence in the term IPV, or intimate partner violence, and domestic violence, there's a lot of non-violent behavior that can be used to gain power and control. And so there's a lot of emotional forms, of abuse, psychological forms of abuse. We don't have a slide with all the forms, but a lot of different means to enact power and control. Family systems, like I said, can support it, and I wanted to define intimate partner relationships a little because this will stem into our thoughts on identity and why, as folks who are providers, we really don't want to have a set image of the case study IPV relationship, or like the way that's going to look, who both parties are going to be. And so this can be current or former relationships. There's a lot of folks who have on and off again relationships. Some of this is necessitated by practical needs, if there are children in common, for folks who have children in common. Also, there's a history of maybe at some point sunnier, happier days. So the emotional complexity of feelings towards one another is one that is not always a clean break situation. Also, romantic partnerships aren't always sexual. I think some folks read intimate partner violence and they assume there has to be some sort of sexually realized aspect. I mean, there can be attraction, particularly with some younger people or not. They're crushing on somebody, and it can be a very volatile, involved relationship where there's a lot of power and control, but there's not yet sexual component. Bridging into the third point, if for folks who are not living together, this domestic, I think, has that legacy too of sharing a home or a domicile, but there are folks who aren't primarily living together. They correspond online. They're in totally different places, or even if they're in the same city, like I said, they don't live together. And we want to think about sort of what that means for why people make choices about the kind of relationships, or the aspects of the relationship, and what we assume about what their needs could look like. So yeah, and of course, lacking or using the word couple. So some folks' norms and behaviors in different communities are not going to talk about being in a relationship. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's not dynamics of power and control. So polyvictimization, this boils down to essentially the idea that the jargony term for many different kinds of victimization can be occurring. So there can be, as a result, lots of complex forms of trauma or layered forms of trauma that occur. Sometimes people think of multiple incidents or episodes of one kind of quote-unquote victimization, but we really want people to think about sort of the map and how things unfortunately can sort of patchwork together. We're going to talk about an example in a second that is a sort of complex form of victimization, but we also wanted to look at the way that folks can experience that victimization across different forms. Earlier in the chat box, someone said intergenerational violence, and what about that? So we do want folks to know that violence, whether polyvictimization related violence or even just a form of violence, can be intergenerational and carry through family systems and communities over time.
Great. So what we wanted to do is just have a note on statistics, and I think if some of you have attended trainings where we're talking about violence, and in particular domestic violence, sexual violence, you always get to that point of the presentation where we talk about those numbers, right? We talk about, Jamal and I talked this through, and we have kind of these mixed feelings on presenting the numbers for a couple of different reasons. One, I think if we think about prevalence and we think about how often these types of victimizations happen, prevalence, you'll often hear those numbers, 1 in 5, 1 in 33, 1 in, right, and dependent upon kind of location, and so it's kind of narrowing our understandings of who experiences violence and how. The other point is that we generally know that incidences of violence, in particular interpersonal violence, so all of the terms we just went through, are vastly underreported. so, kind of the biggest and largest studies, even those have their limitations as to how much reliability we can place on those studies. So what we do want you to know from this, and what we came to and thought was important, was an understanding that vastly underreported, and so any numbers that we have would need to be multiplied. And also that what's often important to look at, and we think is essential, is what are the impacts, right? So statistics and studies on impact of violence is going to be more powerful, we believe, than on prevalence. So with that in mind, we'd like to talk a little bit about kind of some of the more well-known studies, and I'm sure a lot, or maybe most of you, have heard about the ACEs study. And so what that's talking about, that's the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, and this is a big range study over a period of time, which basically measured experiences that people had in childhood, and then following those people, and then looking at outcomes when they reached adulthood. And so some of the things that were looked at were, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, et cetera. And what was really kind of significant and interesting about this study was that it's one of the first that really on a wide scale level,
yeah.
Right, thank you, Jamal, wide scale level, really looked at not only the emotional impacts, but the physical health impacts. And we always, I think if you're in the trauma field or you're in the field of working with interpersonal violence, you know that there are certainly physical, but I think this study was the first to really name that and make that real for a lot of people. What we also wanted to draw your attention to was, so since ACEs has been done, there's been just lots more studies, but one in particular we found really interesting, which was in Philadelphia, where they studied a cohort, and what they were also looking at was incidents of discrimination, community stressors, and economic hardship. And the same outcomes were found. And so really that, for us, tied in with kind of the theme and what we're asking people to consider is that we have to attend to those levels of violence that are not just about one incident of sexual assault or several, but we also have to think about the impacts of socioeconomic status, of community, of incidences of racial prejudicial discrimination, and how those impact people on a daily basis.
For sure. I mean, so a theme we talk about a lot is not sort of siloing someone's experience. And so we, as Josie just said, want to think of, we like these studies because they create breadth and make us think about people as whole people again. The way we give ourselves benefit of the doubt to know our individual complexities. So someone is moving through time and space in their own communities, maybe moving to different communities, and they're experiencing a lot based on what's going on within their home, within their relationships, and also what's going on from outside towards them. And that's why we really liked the study. Another thing that I kind of enjoy about it, and I'll be brief on it because we want to keep moving, is that I think for folks who do trauma work, or that term is sort of a buzz right now, but it really, I think, makes it a lot more, and not to say it in a way that's spooky, but like ubiquitous, or the idea that a lot of folks that you may know may have had traumatic experiences, and really to do that in a way where we hope it moves us to a point where we don't see it as such a stigmatizing foreign thing. There's a lot of work that comes out of that, and I think the ethical piece is then looking about folks' ability to persevere and be resilient in the face of it. You know, for colleagues of mine who work on brain development and neurobiology, Josie included, you know, there's this belief that even if there is a significant impact and we need to know about the connection with social experiences, there's still a lot of plasticity, or the brain's ability to bounce back is really high. So I don't like to get fatalistic with the study, but I do like that it makes us think about how maybe many of us have had a few of those adverse childhood experiences.
Okay. So, you know, we did include both links to the original ACEs study and then the Philadelphia study, which is available as a resource at the close of the webinar.
I think I'm noticing a lot in the chat about folks, I think, wanting to know a bit more about the sexual violence piece, or like the connection between the trauma and the sexual violence. So I think a question earlier is when we talked about, you know, that someone asked us about like an assault versus sexual abuse. And at least from my piece, when we look at some of the socialized narratives that impact people's ability to disclose to you, people's understanding of their own experience of violence. One example a little lower in the slide, so I'll pause and work through the slide, but I think we address sort of a cross-section of victimization that is intimate partner sexual violence, and that can speak to the pattern of abuse a bit more. But really, ultimately, as we talked about in the beginning, and some of you were, I think a few of you said media and just single words about what we think about when we think of violence. Rape is one of the ones. We receive a lot of messages that shape our beliefs. So what is, and I say this while rolling my eyes, but you know, for folks who may have heard the clip of the quote-unquote legitimate rape conversation or comment. So, you know, there are individuals in positions of power and in our communities who hear that from someone on TV, and it reverberates and shapes what they see as sexual violence. And so what does it mean when there's other forms of sex assault, unwelcome sexual coercion, attention, et cetera? But that shapes our assumptions of what's acceptable. That could be a whole other webinar talking about sort of healthy, unhealthy messages we get for folks who are parents on the line and friends of mine who I hear a lot about what they're concerned about, what messages are being put out there for young people and understanding sort of themselves. But a lot of this can perpetuate the rape myths and rape culture that are around us. And for example, when I present on intimate partner sexual violence, I focus a lot on, you know, we think sometimes the legacy of our narrative, it's the stranger rape is the way we think about sexual violence, or the stranger assault. But, you know, something that makes it unique and adds a layer of difficulty for folks to seek services is often the partner has this regular access to them. If anything, they may be validated by community concepts of like, this relationship makes whatever happens in closed doors okay. You know, for folks who historically have had the privilege of marriage, you know, or even are in a couple legally committed relationship, for a very long time, marital rape, and I put that in quotes because, you know, again, you know, not everyone had the ability to be married and still doesn't, but folks who were in committed relationships, there wasn't this belief that you could assault or commit sexual violence against a partner. So that may have contributed to a continuous sort of pattern of sexual abuse by that intimate partner. And this is by no means, like I said, ranking what's better or worse. I just want to give an example of something that crosses between the domestic violence world and also can cross between a sex assault provider world in the way that me and Josie work together a lot. So a lot of the blaming and shaming that may happen for someone in that relationship and for folks in general is what effectively silences them to disclose and seek services.
So one of the things that we wanted to talk about is when we're looking at identity and we're thinking about different forms of violence, and what we often see is siloing of issues, right? So if you are a person who identifies as trans, then you might be sent towards certain services because that is the most, or that is understood to be the most important part of your identity, right? And so just encouraging thinking about language, right? Thinking about how people even have, you know, art can be named differently as they travel through different systems to find relief or to find, you know, to find or to journey from their victimization, right? So you might hear people referred to as victims, survivors, person experiencing abuse, right? And so our experiences of violence, you know, and support and resilience are then influenced by layering identities, right? So we might have experienced violence, and then we might have several other identities that are also impacting the way that our victimization is received, responded to, and the way that we heal from that.
I could give a specific, I know sometimes we talk on a very theoretical level. I remember working with someone to sort of bring this to toe. That's the appropriate use of the idiom. But in a former life, or a few years ago, I was working at a nonprofit that focused on immigrants and refugees, and somebody that I was working with had recently come to the country, and this individual was going through an immigration process. His partner, and this is a trans male identified person, his partner had been able to come to the States a lot earlier. But when she came to, and they were fleeing a situation, so as seeking status, one in which they were using the terms of the fact that their country of origin is one that is increasingly hostile. So they were from a country in the Middle East. And so when they came over, the partner was sexually assaulted. And I remember when this individual reconnected, it was a really layered conversation about where someone saw a support and where someone saw violence against him and his partner, or them as a unit. I think for some of us, me included in a moment, one may think that, oh, because you were granted sort of status to come to a country, you see that country as a safe place. But this is a country where the partner was assaulted. At the same time, if you talk about layers of identity of what it means to be trans in some countries in the world and move here, so there was a lot of assumptions that could be made. I will say that what worked the most was really just to be open and hear from the person what they needed and not to make those assumptions. But that's sort of like a perfect moment for me early on where I learned about how intersectional identity, or like really layered identity, can make certain things we may take for granted based on our exposure as things that we really need to verify with that individual. Language matters. So something we glossed over too is we use victim and survivor and other terms kind of interchangeably to expand the narrative, but these terms can have very different meanings to different folks, again, based on what their experience has been in terms of maybe seeking help and receiving help, or the kind of help that they feel is supportive versus punitive or blaming. And sometimes I've had folks say that, person experiencing or abuse, or person who has been harmed, or something like that, puts person first and doesn't essentialize somebody to an experience. So I think a lot of the times our systems, even well-intended, I challenge everyone here to think about when we're referring to folks too much all the time as victim, 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 because then we build this concept in our mind that we're approaching someone who's maybe just a victim.
And we're also privileging their victimization above other parts
Thank you,
of
Josie.
identity.
Thank you.
And certainly we know that some of the work in long-term treatment is helping someone to reconstruct a narrative that privileges all parts of the person and not just the part that was victimized.
Yes. And then shout out to this term, because we talked about eraser, or things that don't let us know sort of where things come from. It's really important. Intersectional identity, it's jargony. We try to just sort of contextualize it as layered identities, but the really key thing, and this came out of the Black feminist experience, Kimberly Crenshaw herself was one of those folks who coined the term, quote unquote, but it really came out of this understanding and that group of folks wanting people to know that one cannot understand their experience by separating out what it means to be a Black person and a woman independently, but rather that those two identities are interconnected always in spaces they move through. And so they have to be understood, at the intersection of those identities, or around their intersectional identity. When we start to talk about privilege, we want to think about the way that those identities and identity combinations in some spaces can have more relative privilege, and in other spaces don't always. So privilege, here we are. We arrived at the slide. So context of privilege. This should and would take more time in a presentation. So this is not the be-all and end-all, of course, but I hope many of us think about this a lot. We all have identities. So sort of when I do a longer training and I talk about an exercise, if there's any anxiety that comes up when we read this, either because we feel we don't have a lot of relative privilege, or we feel we do and we don't know what to do with that, I think that awareness is a really big step. But the context of privilege, and privilege includes access, are created by certain norms against which all subgroups are compared. So really there's sort of like the archetypical or prototype kind of person who has maybe the most privilege in certain community spaces, and we're all measured against that to some certain degree. In the U.S., some attributes, this is not the exhaustive list, are everything that's listed there. I won't read them out because you all have that copy. But I really like to, when I think of privilege, sometimes we think immediately of folks who consider like privilege as being based around a very explicit ideology of superiority. And that's definitely one factor, that kind of supremacy, and when it comes a lot of times, so whiteness is one of them, maybe white supremacy as a factor, but I really want us to think about how it can float under the radar and permeate systems and communities when we think of it as status quo. And by that I mean, Josie, jump in if I'm getting a little too in my own head, but the idea that like there's certain things we just take for granted. You know, certain folks maybe feel more comfortable taking up more space, and some of us you know, whether we think about it consciously or not, sometimes maybe shrink in certain spaces or feel like by exerting ourselves in spaces that's something that maybe we feel we shouldn't be doing. And, or, you know, oh, when it comes to like, I've been told a lot, like the way we think about sort of the beauty industry and what's seen as something that we all aspire to, you know, certain body types, certain features, et cetera, skin color. So all of those things maybe are a little bit less overt, but that definitely have an impact. And we're going to talk about maybe what does this all have to do with our work, but we want to think about, we'll talk a little bit later about how we as providers, what we're bringing into a space, providers, clinicians, helpers, and then also what the folks who are coming to us for help have experienced in their road to being connected to us, and then what assumptions they may have about what we can or can't do for them.
So one of the things that we've included here is if we're thinking about privilege, and sometimes it helps to concretize the example a bit. But one of the things that we see often is, you know, that women make less money than men, right, for the same kind of work. But if we can unpack that a little bit further, what we can see is, you know, for every dollar that typical male would make, that a white woman would make 77 cents. And certainly that's the narrative, right? That's the number that's been pushed out into the forefront. But if we break that down a little bit further, what we see is that the number goes even lower for certain groups of women, right? And so to both think about the reason why, you know, maybe most of us know that dollar versus 77 cents figure, but maybe not a lot of us are aware of the 64 cents, 56 cents. And that's a really good concrete example of privilege in context. And
privilege that's based on intersectional identity. So what's not there, for example, is considering how maybe, you know, a queer person of any gender identity is going to be compensated for their work, or how would a, you know, a person of color who's a man in that thing be also considered.
Okay, so what we want to do is move toward, you know, all these considerations where we're talking about identity and talking about impact, is then how does that intersect with victimization, right? So what we know is that trauma impact can be intensified based on, you know, either loss of community or maintenance of community. Thinking about identity, if, you know, someone experiences victimization and they're not out in terms of their orientation or their gender identity, how that might impact reporting, right? Thinking about ageism and thinking about, you know, if you're a minor or the partner is a minor, and then also thinking about, you know, if your victimization occurred by someone who is connected with your community, what does it mean to tell on that person? And that's not just for reporting, but what does that mean to talk with a service provider about it? What does that mean to talk to another person in the community about it? What does that mean for loss of community, and particularly in terms of being believed, and then maybe assumptions that might be formed about that community based on just that experience of victimization, right? And so just thinking about, if we're thinking about all those layers of identity and those layers of oppression, layers of privilege, and then what happens on top of that when someone experiences victimization and by whom. So we're going to move forward into just thinking about challenges of disclosure, right?
And we don't have to read them all. There's actually some overlap between the slides. But there's there's a couple there that are practical. So even on that level, just consider language capacity. So we read assumption as to someone who doesn't want to or know how to report something. Maybe their language fluency is one thing. And that we're not taking into account. So there's so much more than in these two slides of lists, but we want you to think about other things that aren't here.
Right, and I think for my work as a provider, it's just to think about kind of the journeys that people have gone through, even in coming to see me and naming it, right? And so just thinking about all that's gone before and thinking about, and then like that information and how that impacts, and just thinking about what that journey has been like and bringing that into consideration. Okay, so we're going to talk about engaging and assessing. So one of the things that we often want to talk about is that, you know, there's often a lot of focus when we're talking about victimization, we're talking about treatment, we're talking about being a provider. What we're talking about is really self-reflection. And, you know, identity doesn't just belong to your client, right? Yeah. So always in the space, what we're thinking about is not just, you know, who is this person and what are their layers of identity, what are the different things that are impacting their victimization, their healing, their disclosure, their coming into the space, but also not asking, you know, our clients to, or not, you know, just othering and saying, well, our clients, we have to consider all these things, but also thinking about what is my identity? What am I bringing into the space? What kind of judgments, and we're going to talk more about that, but just considering self in all of that and how much work we might have done on unpacking our different identities, our different oppressions, our different privileges, and our history of what we bring into the work.
And consider how that, we may have our own, all of us are people. So we talked about expanding the notion of a quote-unquote victim. Not everyone shows up the same way, but think about us too. So if someone in front of you says something that evokes a feeling, what do you do around that feeling, and where does that come from based on your own identities as well?
So a really important concept that we wanted to talk a bit about, and we know that we're running short on time, but was cultural humility.
So cultural humility at its core is just this idea that, there's not a single story. And so that even folks who we may have met in the past who share identities with someone in front of us, we can't just assume based on what we may know or what little we know. Each person has a unique personal experience and history based on things that have happened to them directly and maybe indirectly in their community. And because of that, we want to have them inform us of what's going on. They have complex relationships with systems and folks in their life, so we don't want to assume norms too strongly. We want to be informed, and we want to know sort of our self-inventory about what we're bringing into the space. Cultural humility at its end is a process, whereas cultural competency, which many of you have heard, tends to be a little bit more of a static list kind of approach. Culture as well, and when we say culture, it's in quotations because, again, there's not one fixed culture everyone has. Even within our identity map, our cultural identities are changing because cultures are changing. Despite messages we're getting right now, there's a lot of dynamism in culture and change. So, apart from having someone inform you, sometimes in our best intention, we want to help someone, and we talked about what we see as our provider role, but be mindful that when it comes to folks in front of us who share or don't share identity factors with us, that if we look too much like we're saying, oh, I'm so sorry, it may be well-intended, I want to help you, and I'm so sorry that, where you come from, they treat X people that way. That assumes that that's sort of like a blanket statement, and I know with little time I sound like that's an example that's a little bit clumsy, but we may have more flowery ways to say the same thing. We may not know what that person wants from us yet, so let's not assume that we're best equipped to do so. And then also using culture as a way to sort of say, I want to impress you and say I'm not against your culture, so I can't help you. Sort of the idea of people saying, well, I don't understand, and so I don't really have a role I can play. Sometimes that comes up from folks who feel like if they don't speak the exact same language and they have not the exact same identity map, then they have no way to be of assistance. I think folks on the other side of things wouldn't see that as an effective engagement.
And I think, if you've been in the space for a while, cultural competency used to be the term that was used, which was, I'm going to learn everything I can about a certain culture so that I'm not offending anyone. And really what we've moved into is an understanding that culture is not static, right? It's ever-changing, ever-evolving, the ways that people see their identity and see their world, and the way that those systems and that world is impacting upon them. And that we're not going to become experts on someone's culture. And the way to do that is simply by treating people individually and talking with them about what it means to them, what are the various factors and influences in their lives that make up who they are. And then also talking about an important thing, and this is more into the best practices in working with, but talking about then how does my culture or the way that you're seeing me impact our work together, and what is it like for you as a person who identifies as part of this culture, like for you to work with someone like me who identifies as this culture, and having that be in the space and be acknowledged and something that's been open and talked about.
Yeah, open questions are just kind of the way to start any type of conversation with someone in front of you. I think it's the best way to show that you want to learn from them what they need, how can I help you, rather than what can I do right now.
The other thing we wanted to talk about was judgments, and this is basically to say that we all have judgments, right? And it's not saying that it's okay to have these judgments, but often encouraging providers, encouraging people to just be curious about their judgments, because from that point of curiosity, and sometimes that point of curiosity and discomfort, comes growth and understanding of self. If we judge our judgments and we just say those are bad and I shouldn't be doing that, what that does is cuts off inquiry, and it stunts our ability to grow and learn from those judgments. So we both need to be curious about them and willing to engage in discussions that might not always be comfortable around our judgments, and we also need to be held accountable for them, right? So just thinking about that and encouraging curiosity and growth where judgments are concerned, but also normalizing that as part of the experience of being human.
Yeah. And I think Josie would say this, in a session, if you're in that context, or in a first meeting with somebody who's experienced these forms of victimization we discussed, you want to check in with whoever your supervisor or colleague is about those feelings. I wouldn't say sort of put the person in front of you in the position to tell you, like, well, why am I feeling this way, or are you feeling this way? Because we want to bear in mind that there is sometimes that power imbalance. We talked about privilege. So institutionally, if you're in a provider role, there may be a situation in which the person in front of you may feel less comfortable challenging you or bringing things up to you that press buttons in them, or vice versa. So that's part of that self-awareness, is knowing when to step out and check in with someone else, not let that sort of permeate the client session or the providing session.
So the other thing we really wanted to talk about, and one of the things that we encounter the most in our work, is certainly provider anxiety, right? There can be a great deal of anxiety around asking questions around the experiences that people have had, around how we do that, and then around anxiety around what happens when we get a positive response. So if I work in a space that our charter is not necessarily to work with victimization, but I want to include that because I recognize that that's something that might have had impact on someone's functioning and might be an area where I want to connect them with resources, or we want to at least open up that conversation. How do I ask that question? And if I don't feel equipped, or if I maybe have a personal history with victimization, those are all things that can impact our anxiety. And what we know is that when we're feeling anxious, that anxiety can translate into a lot of different things for both ourselves and the people that we're working with, right? So again, just encouraging curiosity and awareness. If we're feeling anxious, what behavior comes out of that anxiety? Does that mean that we're trying to fix things for our clients? Does that mean that we're avoiding certain discussions or certain conversations? Does that mean that we feel like we need to have all the answers and be super prepared? And what it comes down to is that when you're working with trauma, and you're working in particular with interpersonal trauma, with all those layers of narrative and identity and expression and experience, you're not going to be prepared and you're going to be anxious. And the best that you can do is recognize that anxiety and recognize how that's impacting who you are in the room. Okay. So one of the things that's helpful is if we think about stance and sightseeing, and we know that as providers we sometimes have to ask those questions that are very direct. I think that one of the most helpful things in my work is if I'm asking questions that are direct, I have to say to myself, am I asking this because it's going to further my work with this person? Is it a question of necessity, or is it a question of needing to know, or needing to be in control, or needing to be in power, right? Is this question about experience necessary so that I can provide advocacy, or I can provide treatment, or I can connect to resources? Basically checking in with myself and figuring out this question, where is it coming from? Is it coming from my anxiety? Is it coming from a real need to know and a real need to understand, or is it coming from, a feeling of, well, I'm not in control here, and one of the ways I need to do that is to know every part of the story.
I think to that end, too, practically, when you're working, especially if it's the first time you meet with someone, even if you feel you do need to know it, a sub-question is, do you need to know that now? And being able to prepare someone and say, in the future, I may have to ask some questions because, what do you think about asking some of them today, and are there some that you'd like to leave for another time? When we talk about power imbalance and control, when it comes to domestic or intimate partner violence, being able to give that power back to the person in front of you is a really transformative tool, and it builds trust.
So trauma-informed is a term that we're hearing more and more these days, and as someone who has some training in trauma response and trauma treatment, I both welcome the ubiquitousness of this term, and then I also cringe a little bit because I really want to be able to unpack what that means, right? And to me, trauma-informed basically means that you have the understanding of trauma, its dynamics, and the basic understanding of neurobiology, so that when you're providing services, including assessment and interventions, that you're doing that with a trauma lens. And so what we did was we put together kind of how do you do a trauma-informed assessment, right? And so a lot of times this is both as simple and as complex as being present in the space. And what I mean when I say that is that what we're talking about is, you know, checking in with ourselves, checking in with how we're feeling. Are we anxious? Are we feeling judgmental? Are we making assumptions? Are we noticing what the person in front of us is bringing? Are we noticing their responses to our questions, to being in the room? And how are we handling that information, right? And I think a lot of times when we're working with trauma, one of the things that can happen is that we can kind of float away from spaces, or we can really find ourselves not being present. So really, sometimes it's as simple as grounding ourselves and being in the moment and really checking in with what's going on for us and what's going on for the person in front of us.
And Josie was talking about, you know, I think subset of that is reading the nonverbal cues. And again, not making assumptions with some of the basic, it's not in the slide, but sort of trauma information is that a reaction can be aggressive. Although someone is appreciative of the help, it can seem completely shut down. Doesn't mean that someone isn't focusing on what you're saying or processing. So really expanding the notion of what that reaction looks like is part of, I think, a trauma-informed assessment.
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of times, too, it boils down to our role. I think a lot of times we become kind of investigators.
Yeah.
And really, that's not our role as providers, right? It's not our role to find out if someone's being truthful or what really happened to someone. And when we think about trauma, and particularly sexual violence, domestic violence, and intimate partner violence, there are many things to consider, and usually not one of them is what's the truth of this situation and what's the entire narrative.
Yeah.
So really thinking about, you know, are we in that investigator role, or are we letting things come as they happen?
Never mind the fact that trauma impacts memory, and I know Josie in separate presentations focuses on this a lot. So even if we think that's something productive and we're saying that it isn't necessarily, you may not, that person, when they say they don't know, there's reasons based in sort of that trauma-informed analysis you have for why someone may not be able to recall things. And being able to be an advocate for that person with investigators is really helpful. Giving that context to folks who may not have that trauma-informed lens is a really, really supportive thing you can do to support somebody who's coming in to meet with you.
So for assessment, what we've included for resources is kind of supportive statements and ways of asking questions, ways of normalizing experience, and ways of using reflective listening in order to help both ourselves be centered in the moment and also to help the people that we're working with feel heard and connected to. And so we're including those as, you know, takeaways for today. I know we're reaching the end of our time, so we did want to see if there were questions, and if not, what we would be happy to do is kind of tie together, you know, and kind of give like a brief overview of what we've talked about today, and understanding that this is the first of a series. So if we're not seeing any questions, and I'm not sure we are right now, I think one of the things we really wanted to talk about was just having those considerations of the different kind of experiences that people have had, taking into account that reactions to those experiences are individual and can change between persons or even within the same person over a period of time. One of the things that might seem like it's coming from nowhere, but I think is always important to mention, is this concept of resilience, and this concept of even though people have had many different experiences or might have had, we sometimes might wonder, you know, how does that impact a person? How are they functioning? People who have experienced victimization are many things, and so we have to always consider their strength and resilience, and particularly when we're thinking about the ways that they find their way to us and the things that have gone before. And the ability to name that and disclose is something that I am supremely grateful for in my work.
Thanks, everybody.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to Josie and Jamal. As you can tell, they're both amazing and so very thoughtful. I have to tell you, they've spent a lot of time putting this presentation together for everyone, and I'm really grateful that you've been able to hear from them and learn from them today. If you have any other questions, please chat into the chat box for us. We'd love to hear them. Otherwise, we're going to just wrap it up, and I wanted you to see that this is the first webinar in our series called Shattering Walls. These are the upcoming events in our series. In March, we're going to have a webinar called Breaking the Silence, a national, a woman who does some work nationally around this topic. She is a survivor. She will be presenting for us. We're then going to have a man named Dennis Tyson who will be presenting in April around understanding childhood sexual abuse. He's also a survivor and has a lot of great information to share with providers. We're then in May going to have a presentation on community-based interventions. And then we're going to have Josie back in June, and maybe Jamal, around best practices so that we can wrap it up with our series around focusing on best practices. So any last questions, thoughts, or concerns? We'd love to hear from you. Otherwise, we will say goodbye and enjoy your weekend. I don't see anything. The slides will be available by next week, as well as that wonderful, I'm just going to show you, I don't know if we got to bring this up, the handout that they created for you, which is really wonderful, looking at universalizing statements, support statements, and then looking at first aid, what we call psychological first aid. So that handout will also be available on our website. Oh, we do have one question here that I think we have enough time to get to. What is the best way to approach this without invalidating or accusing a false claim? Oh, sorry, it started earlier. So the question is, a client who makes exaggerated claims of numerous sexually violent crimes, including accusations against case managers, providers, and uses these instances to justify self-destructive behaviors. What's the best way to approach this without invalidating or accusing of false claims? That's a great question. This is from Teresa. I'm going to look to Josie to see if you'd like to take a stab at that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that you're right in the approach. You know, I think often when we have people that are talking about experiences and talking about things that have happened, you know, if we take a combative or kind of a confrontational approach to that, that's not going to result in any kind of deeper understanding for the provider or for the client. I think what I'd encourage here is to think about, you know, what is the person hoping for in terms of making the claims? Are they not being heard? Are they looking for, and in particular in terms of, you know, the self-destructive behaviors, are they looking for reasons for those behaviors that are rooted in something else? But really, for when I have people that are talking about experiences, again, it's not trying to get to the truth or the mistruth of them, but really thinking about what's behind the question, what are they trying to get at, and really the shortcut to that is asking the person. I could make interpretations about what someone's trying to do or attempting to do based on those statements, but really the shortcut to that is just thinking about, so what is this person in particular trying to receive? Are they getting it or are they not?
And a little bit too, I'd like to Josie to give me a visual cue right now, but I know in my environment as someone who isn't, you know, a clinician, when it comes to things like this, if you don't have someone on the team who could step in to sort of support you or the case managers, if this is happening with frontline workers, to a certain degree, you know, we think a lot about the ways that folks with any sort of mental health needs are stigmatized, and I by no means want to conflate what you're saying as definitively that each and every time, but there are folks who are experiencing a lot of mental health disabilities or have mental health needs that are susceptible to victimization by some people in their history, and the way they may be communicating that to you may be connected to that narrative. So it's really important to check in with folks who may help them work through that. That's just been my experience with folks who come to our center who have experiences where it is difficult for me to understand, maybe in my sense, like what has happened with someone in staff. You know, I don't, like Josie said, we never want to discount wholly that there may have been an experience that has occurred there, but just to probe a little bit more. There's a question on queer challenges for queer folks.
Can I just chime in really quickly? I want to add that I think we're going to get to this in our best practices webinar, because I think some of what you're getting at is dysregulation and a kind of a trauma response around impact. And so I think that we're going to get to that in our best practices as well. So thank you.
one more question. I think this is really important.
Yeah, there's a question about unique challenges that queer folks face regarding coercive control. So sometimes I think we address things really quickly, and that's probably the problem, that it was too quick. So I think when we think about coercion, depending on whether a queer person's either, and I don't know if you mean gender identities or gender queerness, or if we're talking about sexual orientation or both, but whether those identities are known to folks in their life, folks who are in positions of power over them, or just folks who are near and dear to them. But I think sometimes a partner can, if that's not something that's known, threaten to out them in that way. When we think about sort of the intersectional experiences and resources that may be attached to that, if somebody's, for example, in a situation where they have any sort of medication, so if someone has any sort of, either they're transitioning or they may have any sort, in the context of this relationship, I've seen for once, or prior one time where a partner knowingly had an STI or sexually transmitted infection, and as part of the coercive control was not allowing the partner to use any sort of contraception, or condoms, is what I mean, which sometimes can be a contraceptive. So that person was exposed to STIs, and because of that, they were saying, well, if you say anything, I'm going to let folks know this, and this is a point of embarrassment for you. This is something that could jeopardize you professionally, et cetera. If it's something really dire, HIV medication, and that person really needs to be taking that consistently, that person can say, for example, they also have some sort of mental health need. They will move around that medication and say, oh, you forgot that you put it here. This is why I need to be able to make all the decisions in our relationship. So with the very little time we had, I was trying to flesh out an example, but there can be a lot around exposure of identity and around shaming around queer identity.
That's great. Thank you so much. So as you can see, we are at our time limit, and you have some really great information and presenters here to share it with you. Again, our slides will be available as well as the resource on our website next week. You can always reach out to us if you have any more questions. I'm just going to ask Josie to come up here and go to the final slide. And so you can contact us and go to our website. And thank you so much for your time today. We hope you have a wonderful weekend, and we hope to see you at our future events. Take good care, everyone. Bye-bye.